I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
This evening we are in Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5. We're going to read the first 4 verses of this chapter, and then we'll get into what we're talking about. We're on page 12 of our books, if you're looking for the page in our books. Page number 12 in Daniel chapter 5. So, Henry, why don't you get verse 1? Bill and Tammy can get verses 2 and 3, and I'll get verse 4 of Daniel chapter 5.
5 verse 1. Belshazzar the king made a great feast for the thousands of his lords, and drank wine in the presence of the sovereign.
While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father, Nebuchadnezzar, had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them.
Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them.
They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. We're going to now get into a section of Daniel that's not written chronologically. When we get to chapter 7 and 8, and when we get to the prophecies, we're actually going to find that they occur before the events of chapter 5. And of course, they occur before the events of chapter 6, because chapter 6 continues on from the events of chapter 5. And so it's necessary that we realize that, as is true in a lot of books, we're not always given a chronological order. The narrative is in chronological order. But then when we get to chapter 7, we're going to start getting into prophecy. And we're going to start seeing visions of Daniel that he had. And so he's going to outline, okay, this occurred in this year or this reign. And so we mustn't get too tied down on, okay, well, this should keep following the exact narrative timeline that we're following. No, it goes back and forth. The book of Matthew is not written chronologically. The book of, sometimes even the books of history are not completely written chronologically. And so we shouldn't get, again, tied up on that point. But what we're going to read here is not a fable. It's not a fairy tale. It's not just a good story we tell children. This was a story that actually happened. It was like Lot's wife, a story that actually happened, the Red Sea crossing, Jesus' resurrection. For a long time, the king that is mentioned here was not thought to have existed. Historians and archaeologists thought that this was just religious propaganda or religious allegory, or like as far as it represented something. It was fiction written by Daniel. Maybe not even by Daniel, by someone else later on to help build up the Jewish history. And so they had a fable like this from chapter 5 as to how did Babylon fall? Well, it fell by the hand of God, and so on and so forth. This is presented as history. Daniel is spoken of in the New Testament as a prophet that existed. And so we should regard this as a history. Now, does secular history hold up this story? Not specifically, but the events that surround this story, absolutely. When we read in history about the fall of the Babylonian Empire. It's going to be presented to us in chapter 5 here of Daniel as happening very quick. If history would show that no, Cyrus the Great came along and it was tens of years, long battles, and Babylon fell over a long period of time, then we could come along and say, well, what's going on here? Is this really narrative, or is this some fictional story that's being presented by Daniel? No, Babylon fell overnight. The Medes and the Persians diverted the Tigris and Euphrates River so that they could walk into Babylon. And they took it in the night, by surprise. Exactly how Daniel presented it here. That archaeology doesn't show this feast, well, I should say not. It was one night and a feast. It was not going to be something that Cyrus or the people who took over Babylon, the Medes and the Persians, would have really taken note of. They're not going to have that, but we do have the scriptures telling us that. But the king of Babylon is no longer Nebuchadnezzar. That's where we left off in chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar was king of Babylon. And it might be tempting to come along and think of what relation, if we just read the passage and take the words used there as the way we use words today, what relation would Belshazzar be to Nebuchadnezzar? Sort of have to peek into verse 2.
From here, it would be his son.
His son. And history will grab onto that in archaeology. Aha, Belshazzar is not Nebuchadnezzar's son. And history now would show that he was not. In fact, Scripture would show that he is not. Let's go to 2 Kings 25. I'm hoping I got it. Yes, I did. If we go to 2 Kings 25, and we come down to verse 27. Let's read verses 27 and 28. And I'll get Henry to get verse 27, Bill to get verse 28. Chapter 25. 2 Kings 25. Yeah, 2 Kings 5 is not going to make much. Yeah. 25, 27. 2 Kings 5, I think it's the story of Naaman, if I remember right. Chapter 25 of 2 Kings, verse 27 for Henry, 28 for Bill.
Now it came to pass in the 37 years of captivity with Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, at evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that it began to rain, released Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from prison.
He spoke kindly to him and gave him a more prominent seat than those of the kings who were with him in Babylon.
Okay. So remember, Jehoiachin was the king who reigned for 3 months before Nebuchadnezzar came along and deposed him and installed Zedekiah as the final king. Now, it's interesting to me. First of all, we know Abel-Merodach. Abel-Merodach is his Babylonian name. Abel-Merodach is how it's translated for us from the Hebrew into English. But if you were... you'd actually have his name in Chaldean being Amel-Marduk. Marduk is one of the gods of the Babylonian pantheon, so it should not surprise us that he be named after one of the false gods of the Babylonians. But his reign, I was looking on here to figure out where he reigned. He didn't reign for long. He reigned for about 2 years before he was overthrown and murdered. But history would have us have him reigning about 562 BC. That would be when Nebuchadnezzar died. Well, the scriptures here are very specific. In the 37th year of the captivity. Well, we know Jehoiachin and Jerusalem fell for the second time in 597 BC. We know that from history when Nebuchadnezzar came in. Well, let's take 562, add 37, and we get 599. So in other words, we're within a couple years of this, and again, it's our dating too that we have to realize. So we're sitting in there within the first year. So we can go down to 561 and add our 37 to get 598. The scriptures are accurate with the time period it's talking about. Amel-Merodach didn't come in after Nebuchadnezzar reigned just after he deposed Jehoiakim or Zedekiah. Nebuchadnezzar reigned for a total of 30 years after 25 years after he sacked Jerusalem for the final time. We know that somewhere in between there he went mad for a period of time and wasn't ruling, but that the kingdom was restored to him. But eventually, of course, he died. And Amel-Merodach is his son, Abel-Merodach. So we know from Scripture that Belshazzar cannot be the next son of Nebuchadnezzar. But we need to also remember that Scriptures use the word son in a different way than we do. What do we usually call the son of someone? So if we have a father and he had a son, and that son had a son, what do we call the second son? Grandson. And what do we call the one after that? Great grandson. And we go further on down. Would it be wrong if we just came along and said son? No, it wouldn't be wrong. We've added grand in order to help us delineate generations. To come along and say, okay, I know that this man he wasn't physically his son, he is his grandson. Well, in Matthew chapter 1, Jesus is referred to as the son of Abraham and the son of David. Well, we know that there are over about 2,000 years between Abraham and Jesus, and about 1,000 years from between David and Jesus. And yet he's still referred to as his son. That's how Scriptures use son. That's how the ancients use the word son. It means descendant of. So Amel-Merodach was the second after Nebuchadnezzar. He was actually killed by Nerigalazar. He was the fourth king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. He reigned for about 4 years until he was succeeded by Marduk. And so that would be the fifth king. And then we come along to the final king, the final full king of Babylon, which is Nabonidus. Nabonidus had a son who was named Belshazzar. And the reason, you may not know this, but the reason Nabonidus became king was not because he was necessarily related to Nebuchadnezzar. It turns out Belshazzar was the one who killed the Babylonian king. And Nabonidus became king almost by accident. Nabonidus was the king. However, later in his reign, he went off into almost exile. And Belshazzar, who we find in Daniel chapter 5, was co-regnant with his father. And he actually was co-regnant in Babylon and would have been the one who was defeated when Babylon was taken. This is from a man who many people didn't think to exist until about the last 25 years. No one's ever written about Belshazzar until we find evidence that he existed. But the Bible, of course, had said he existed for over 2,500 years. This teaches us a lesson that when it comes to archaeology and science. Science and archaeology may delay finding out what the Bible has already told us. But when science and archaeology actually prove something, when they find evidence that can prove something, the Bible has been shown to be right first. Now, science comes along and is teaching a lot of things that are contradictory to the Bible today. But it's not like they're using different evidence than we are. They are interpreting it differently. The reason why Belshazzar wasn't thought to be have existed is because they didn't find archaeology with his name on it, like rocks and cylinders and artifacts with his name on it. And so they came along and said, well, if we can't find it, therefore it must not exist. Well, that's a silly thing to do. Silence doesn't say anything. Just like silence, when it comes to authority, doesn't authorize anything, silence doesn't prove anything. A thousand years from now, we're going to all be long forgotten. None of us, I'm going to venture a guess that none of us are going to be presidents and prime ministers and powerful leaders. We're all going to be lost to history. However, if, say, someone wrote about, say, Bill, I don't know what Bill would have done, but say someone wrote about Bill, and it was in a document, and 1,000 years from now say, well, we got no evidence that Bill existed. Therefore, this document that mentions him, therefore, it must be wrong. It must be a source of fiction. Why? Well, we don't have any other corroborating evidence to corroborate that. And then, lo and behold, maybe 1,000 years later, they find a tombstone with your name on it. Oh, well, he really did exist. Because why did people not believe it? Well, they relied on silence. Silence doesn't prove anything. It doesn't disprove anything either. You could have been a work of fiction. But so we can't come along and say, well, if archaeology doesn't prove it, therefore the Bible is wrong. That logically doesn't hold. And we need to be careful of that type of thinking. The Bible spoke on it. The Bible has been shown to be truthful all the way along. So why are we going to doubt, not when archaeology has proven that it can't be true, but archaeology hasn't proven anything? Well, now Belshazzar, of course, is found in history, and he is exactly the man that the Bible portrays him to be. He wasn't full king, and that's why, and even if you read this chapter, you would know that Belshazzar wasn't the full king. We're going to find out why that is later on in this chapter. But we do know Belshazzar was king. He was co-regnant here. What did he do in verses 1 to 4?
He threw a big feast and party.
He threw a great feast and a party. Who was invited? Just 1,000 close friends. Who's having? If COVID wasn't happening, who's having 1,000 close friends to their house for a party? Not many. It is a drunken party too. And the ironic thing is that at the very time of this party, this is perhaps why Babylon could fall so easily. Not only was this a drunken party, but a lot of people were there. You want to take down, like as far, I don't know if you've ever seen the television show Designated Survivor, but it was a show on a few years ago, and how a man who was played by Kiefer Sutherland became president of the United States when he wasn't supposed to be. And how did they do that? Well, when the president of the United States was speaking to Congress, terrorists blew up the Capitol building. And since almost all of the government was present at that speech, the designated survivor became president of the United States. Well, here, 1,000 of his lords, the big the most important people in the kingdom were here at this drunken feast. Now, they weren't going to be the soldiers, no, but they were the people in charge. And at the very time of this drunken feast, Babylon was under siege by the Medes and the Persians. It's night. The Medes and the Persians are going to attack in the middle of the night. But Babylon, because it was protected by the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, was thought to have been impregnable. They weren't really worried because of the walls of Babylon. But they were wrong. Belshazzar, they were drinking wine. What did they bring specifically to this feast to be used at the party?
Well, the vessels they had taken out of the temple when they destroyed it.
Okay, yeah. So we know Nebuchadnezzar sacked the temple, took the gold vessels, silver vessels out of the temple, and they used these to toast their idol gods. And this would have been a mockery of the God of the Jews. They were using the gods, the articles of the temple of supposedly the true God of heaven, and they're toasting their gods, Marduk and Sin, the god, and Bel, and some of the other gods of the Babylonians. Nebuchadnezzar might have come to knowledge of the true God, but that didn't eradicate idolatry from Babylon. And what it would have been saying is that Babylon's gods were greater than the gods of the Jews because, after all, we have all the articles of the God of the Jews. The Chaldeans had learned nothing from people like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and had learned nothing from what Nebuchadnezzar had learned. Belshazzar was, what did I say? This is at least, he could have been he could have been a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar by the fact that Nabonidus was thought to have married a daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. And so Belshazzar could have been a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. He would have been related to him somehow. But he wasn't in the line of kings. He wasn't supposed to be king. And so they learned nothing. In fact, when we get to Daniel later on in the chapter, it's going to seem like Daniel was a much forgotten man. We've come ahead. This would have been in 538 BC. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar died in about 562 BC. This is about 538 BC. And so we're 70 years from the beginning of the captivity and the beginning of Daniel. So if Daniel was 15, 16 at the youngest in Daniel chapter 1, 70 years later, he's in his mid-80s. He could be in his 90s by now. Not the young, vigorous man that we read of earlier in the book. He would have been an elderly man here, still capable, still worshiping God and having God work through him, but he is not the young man. Belshazzar is a younger man. And so Daniel's largely forgotten, at least to Belshazzar. It's going to take someone to remember Daniel for him to come later on. But God would use all of the things that he has brought together to fulfill his prophecies to Judah and to Israel. Let's get some of those prophecies. Tammy, you want to get Isaiah 13, verses 1 and 17 to 22. I'll let you get all of that. And Henry, do you want to get Jeremiah 51? We'll stick there. I'll give you 1 to 6, and I'll give Bill 7 to 11. We're going to stay in Jeremiah 51 for a second. But first of all, I want to get Isaiah 13, verse 1 and then 17 to 22.
The burden against Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz saw. Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them, who will not regard silver, and as for gold, they will not delight in it. Also their bows will dash the young men to pieces, and they will have no pity on the fruit of the womb. Their eye will not spare children. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It will never be inhabited, nor will it be settled from generation to generation, nor will the Arabian pitch tents there, nor will the shepherds make their sheepfolds there. The wild beasts of the desert will lie there, and their houses will be full of owls. Ostriches will dwell there, and wild goats will caper there. The hyenas will howl in their citadels, and jackals in their pleasant palaces. Her time is near to come, and her days will not be prolonged.
This is very interesting here that Isaiah lived before the northern kingdom's Assyrian captivity. The Assyrians were the power when Isaiah was alive. And yet, the Chaldeans are seen on the horizon as the ones who defeat the Assyrians. And even the Babylonians are talked about as not being around forever either. The Medes and the Persians are prophesied to be the ones who would take Babylon. 150, 200 years before the Medes and the Persians were ever thought of to be any power at all. And yet Isaiah here is prophesying about them. Let's go to Jeremiah 51. Jeremiah 51. Henry, you can get 1 to 5. Bill 6 to 11. And we'll continue on through the chapter in a little bit. But Jeremiah chapter 51, we'll start at verse 1.
Thus says the Lord, Behold, I will raise up against Babylon, against those who dwell in the net of a destroying wind, and I will send winders to Babylon, which shall winnow her and empty her net. For in the days of doom, it shall be against her alarm, against her net the anchor, bend his bow, and lift himself up against her in his army. Now the spell for young men, utterly destroy all her army. Thus slain shall fall in the land of the Chaldeans, and those who trust the sword in her streets. For Israel is not forsaken, nor Judah, but his God, the Lord of hosts, though their land was filled with sin against the Holy One of Israel.
Flee from the midst of Babylon, and each of you save his life. Do not be destroyed in her punishment, for this is the Lord's time of vengeance. He is going to render recompense to her. Babylon has been a golden cup in the hand of God, intoxicating all the earth. The nations have drunk of her wine, therefore the nations are going mad. Suddenly Babylon has fallen and been broken. Wail over her, bring balm for her pain. Perhaps she may be healed. We applied healing to Babylon, but she was not healed. Forsake her and let us each go to his own country, for her judgment has reached to heaven and towers up to the very skies. The Lord has brought about our vindication. Come and let us recount in Zion the work of the Lord our God. Sharpen the arrows, fill the quivers. The Lord has aroused the spirit of the kings of the Medes, because his purpose is against Babylon to destroy it. For it is the vengeance of the Lord, vengeance for his temple.
All right, so it could be very tempting for the Babylonians, and Nebuchadnezzar thought this, and that's why he was humbled by God, to think that because he defeated Israel, that he must be righteous. God must be with him and approve of all the things that he's doing. What do we learn from Jeremiah 51 about how the Lord was using Babylon and what the Lord thought of what Babylon did?
thought, figurative, but where it said Babylon has been a golden cup in the hand of God. It's telling us that he had a purpose for them. There's something special. He was using that.
Does that mean he approved of their kings and their actions?
No.
No, it does not.
No.
In fact, idolatry, as I've been going through the Old Testament, especially in Deuteronomy, if you've ever read Deuteronomy, it's an interesting read from chapters 5 through 11. Because Moses spends almost 6 chapters telling Israel, don't go off into idolatry. You're going to get yourself into trouble if you go off into idolatry. God's a merciful God, but look at how close you came to God destroying you because you went after idolatry. That's the evil that God will not forgive unless we give up idolatry. When we think of the sins that Abraham committed, Abraham lied about Sarah and to Abimelech and to the Pharaoh of Egypt. Abraham even tried to help God out by substituting Ishmael for the seed of promise. Abraham wasn't a perfect man. However, God forgave Abraham because Abraham followed God in faith. He didn't go after other gods. He followed the true God. God would forgive Abraham of his sins because Abraham, yes, repented, but Abraham didn't go off and serve other gods. David, we come along and say, well, David did some pretty bad things. Why did God forgive him? David repented. Yes, he did. And that was necessary. David didn't go off and serve other gods. Solomon, his son, was different. Solomon, his son, made mistakes too. But Solomon, his son, went after other gods. That was an abomination to God. God wouldn't forgive Solomon of that. Solomon didn't give up idols. All the epitaphs of the kings of Israel, the northern nation of Israel, they would not give up the sin which Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, caused them to sin, the idols in Dan and Bethel. Idolatry is an affront to God. If we want to be forgiven of the sins we commit, we cannot go after idols. We cannot worship other gods. That's how serious idolatry is. And so when it comes to Babylon, Babylon was executing God's wrath upon Judah for the idolatry that they were committing. However, because Babylon itself was worshiping idols, it was going to be brought down too. God brings down nations that do not serve him. If Babylon would have worshipped the true God of heaven, God would not have destroyed them. I'm certain of that. He spared the Assyrians in Nineveh at the preaching of Jonah because they repented. Now the Assyrians would later be defeated years later. But the Assyrians repented, Nineveh repented, God relented. Belshazzar was an idolater. Babylon was full of idolatry. Jeremiah, in the days of Zedekiah, prophesied Babylon will fall. God will bring justice. But he will do it in his time. But Jeremiah, even Jeremiah, prophesied it would be by the hands of the Medes and the Persians. By Cyrus, and we'll meet Darius here at the end of chapter 5 and the beginning of chapter 6. That is who God was going to use to bring justice to the Babylonians.
I'm not ashamed to